Have you ever felt like something impossible happened at exactly the right moment? As if reality itself paused just long enough to change your path? Most people believe the universe follows the same rules for everyone. Predictable, impersonal, unchanging. But what if that's only true? Until a rare moment of perfect alignment. Some physicists describe reality as a field of endless possibilities. Mystics have spoken for centuries about moments when life seems to respond in unexpected ways. Whether you see that as metaphor or personal experience, many people recognize the feeling of a turning point that can't easily be explained. What if you've been noticing strange coincidences, unexpected opportunities, or an inner pull that refuses to disappear? What if those moments are inviting you to pay closer attention instead of promising that the universe has singled you out? In this video, we'll explore why some experiences feel extraordinary, what the idea of the quantum field actually suggests, and how your focus, perception, and choices can shape the way you experience reality. Stay until the end, because the one exception may not be that the field broke its rules. It may be that you finally learned how to notice what was always possible.
The exception is not the field breaking its rules. It is the field applying its rules at a resolution most people never encounter, because most frequencies never reach the configuration required to make contact with what operates at that resolution. You reaching the threshold that triggered this transmission is not the universe making a special case out of affection. It is your field configuration finally matching the frequency at which this specific channel of the quantum field operates. The exception is the confirmation that the frequency match was achieved. And what the field delivers through that channel, to the configurations that make contact with it, is not accessible to every receiver. Not because of exclusion, because of frequency. What you are about to receive through this video is real, it is specific, and it is not available at every frequency. The quantum field holds configurations in the implicate order that it does not surface into the observable layer of ordinary collective experience. Not because it is secretive, because most fields that interact with the observable layer are not coherent enough to receive these configurations without distorting them. A transmission delivered into a fragmented field does not arrive intact. It gets filtered, reduced, interpreted through the existing framework of the receiver, and what emerges is a partial version that resembles the original the way a photocopy resembles a photograph taken in perfect light. What the field never reveals to the general field is the direct perception of one's own frequency configuration from the inside. The specific, unmediated recognition of what your field actually is, not as a concept, not as a label or a description, but as a direct experiential knowing of the frequency you are actually operating at and what that frequency makes available to you that other configurations do not have access to. This is what the field usually withholds, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. The receiver that is not yet coherent enough to hold this recognition without immediately distorting it through the filters of the existing self-concept does not receive it. Because receiving it partially would be worse than not receiving it at all. A partial recognition of your own frequency that immediately gets filtered through the previous framework produces a distorted self-concept, more entrenched than before, now reinforced by the partial contact with something real. The exception is the field determining that your configuration has reached the coherence required to receive this without the distortion. To hold the recognition at the depth it arrives at, to let it land as description rather than aspiration. This is what the exception delivers. The first part of what the field is revealing through this transmission is this: your frequency is higher than you have been allowing yourself to operate from. Not higher than you sense it is. Higher than you have been giving yourself permission to inhabit consistently. The gap that exists in your daily experience between the moments when your field is fully coherent and you can perceive clearly, move precisely, create with a quality that surprises you, and the moments when the ordinary drift back to the baseline frequency occurs, that gap is not evidence of the distance between where you are and where you are going. It is evidence of the distance between where you actually are and where you have been habitually operating from. Your actual frequency, the configuration your field has been built to by the entire preparation period, by every threshold crossed and every season moved through, is the elevated moments. Those moments of expanded clarity are not peaks above your normal state. They are the signal of your actual field frequency briefly breaking through the habitual operating frequency that the preparation period has not yet fully displaced. The exception the quantum field made for you is the delivery of this specific recognition that you have been operating below your actual frequency. Not permanently, not because of failure, because the infrastructure of the previous frequency is still partially active, still generating the baseline that the elevated moments are exceptions to, when the inverse is true. The elevated moments are your actual frequency. The drift is the exception. What the full recognition of this shifts, and why it matters more than anything else the field could have revealed, is what comes next. Stay inside this. There was a specific conversation that changed how I understood my own frequency, and I want to share it, because it is the clearest example I have of what the exception the field makes looks like from the inside. I was in what I would describe as a genuinely elevated period. Things were moving with unusual ease. The synchronicities were clustered and precise. The creative output was of a quality that felt like it was coming through me rather than from me. The field was clearly operating at a high coherence configuration, and everything in my experience reflected that. And I said something to someone I trusted that I immediately recognized as wrong the moment it left my mouth. I said, "I hope this lasts." The wrongness of it was immediate and specific. Not that the hoping was bad, that the framing was inverted. What I was experiencing was not a temporary elevated state I was hoping would last. It was the actual frequency of my field, briefly free of the habitual operating pattern that was below it. I was hoping the exception would last when the exception was the baseline. I was hoping the signal would persist when it was the noise that was the visitor. That inversion, recognizing that the elevated state was the reality and the drift was the exception rather than the other way around, is one of the most significant recognitions I have had. And it is what the quantum field is delivering through this video, not the hope that the elevated moments will last. The recognition that they are what you actually are. And the drift is the exception. Subscribe. Stay in the sequence that this recognition opens. The second part of what the field is delivering through this exception is equally specific. The quantum revelation has been communicating with you for longer than you have been consciously receiving it. The synchronicities that you filed under coincidence, they were not coincidence. The inner knowing that arrived without evidence to support it. It was not wishful thinking. The specific moments of clarity that appeared and then dissolved before you could fully integrate them, they were not glitches in your perception. They were the field's transmission arriving through every channel available to it, calibrated to your frequency, specific in their content, consistent in their direction. What the revelation communicates is not general spiritual encouragement. It is specific intelligence, information about the field's configuration, about what is being built in the implicate order, about where the trajectory of your frequency is heading, and what becomes available at the configurations you are approaching. This intelligence has been arriving. The exception the field made for you was the decision that your coherence has reached the level where the transmission can now arrive with the clarity it has always been carrying. The quantum revelation is not a concept or a channel or a metaphor for spiritual development. It is the field's own intelligence, the quantum layer of reality communicating directly with receivers whose coherence makes direct communication possible. You are one of those receivers now. The exception confirmed it. Write in the comments, "The field chose me." As the recognition that the intelligence has always been present, and the exception is the field confirming that the reception is now clear enough to receive it at full amplitude. The exception the field made for you is not a future event you are waiting for. It is a current field state that is already expressing itself in your experience. The specific quality of synchronicities in the recent period has changed. Not more frequent necessarily, more legible. Where synchronicities used to feel meaningful but not precisely decodable, they have been arriving with a quality of specific relevance that the previous frequency could not have produced. The field communicating more clearly through the same channels because the receiver has become coherent enough to resolve the signal with greater precision. The creative or expressive output that moves through you has been carrying something that previous output did not carry, not a technical improvement. A frequency quality. The specific signature of a receiver operating close enough to its actual frequency that what it produces reflects that frequency rather than the habitual operating baseline. Other people are noticing it before you are because they perceive it from the outside without the self-assessment filters that prevent you from reading it accurately from the inside. And the resistance to inhabiting the elevated state has been decreasing, not because the elevated state is becoming easier to maintain, because the gap between the elevated state and the habitual baseline has been narrowing. The exception the field made is accelerating the convergence between the two. The elevated state is becoming less elevated and more normal. The drift is becoming more recognizable as the exception rather than the return to baseline. These are the signatures of the exception already being active in your field. The exception the field made for you carries a specific invitation that is different from the invitations of previous transmissions. It is not the invitation to work harder toward the frequency. It is not the invitation to practice the practices that build the coherence. Both of those invitations belong to the stages that preceded this one. What the exception delivers is not an invitation to build. It is an invitation to receive what was already built, to acknowledge the actual frequency of your field as the operating ground rather than continuing to treat the habitual baseline as normal and the actual frequency as exceptional. In practice, this means a specific kind of inner honesty. The next time the elevated state arises, the next moment of expanded clarity, of synchronicities clustering, of the creative output carrying the quality of something moving through rather than being produced, the invitation is to name it accurately, not as an elevated peak above your normal state, as your normal state, as what you actually are when the habitual frequency is not generating interference. That naming is not a claim or a performance. It is the most precise description available of what is actually happening in your field in those moments. And the repeated practice of naming it accurately, rather than treating it as something exceptional that you are hoping persists, gradually displaces the habitual baseline until the accurate frequency becomes the actual operating ground. The exception the field made was not for a moment, it was for this phase. The receiving is ongoing. The revelation is unfolding. This is not the peak of it. Here is what the field made an exception to deliver, complete in one place. You have been operating below your actual frequency. The elevated moments are the signal. The drift is the exception. The gap between where you are and where you sense you are moving toward is smaller than the habitual baseline makes it appear. Because the habitual baseline is the exception, and your actual frequency is already at or near where you have been sensing you are approaching. The quantum revelation has been communicating with you for longer than you have been consciously receiving it. The synchronicities were not coincidence. The inner knowing was not wishful thinking. The quantum field does not make exceptions for isolated individual fields in isolation from the morphic network that connects all fields at similar frequencies. When your configuration reached the threshold that triggered the exception, every field in the morphic network at a similar configuration was affected. The event of one receiver reaching the threshold and receiving the transmission strengthens the availability of the same threshold crossing for every field approaching it. This is how the network evolves, not through coordinated effort or shared doctrine, but through the quantum mechanics of a morphic field that registers each threshold crossing and makes the crossing more available to every approaching configuration. Your exception is part of a pattern of exceptions, a period in which many fields simultaneously reach the configuration that triggers the field's direct transmission. You are not alone in having received this. You are part of a cohort of fields that the revelation is reaching simultaneously. And each field in the cohort that receives and inhabits the exception strengthens the network for every other field still approaching the threshold. The person in your field who is approaching this threshold needs this transmission. Send this while it is active. The exception the field makes extends through the network one receiver at a time. The quantum field never does this, and it did it for you, not as a gift extended outside the rules, as the mechanics operating at a resolution most frequencies never encounter. The field delivering to a receiver that has finally achieved the coherence to receive it intact, without distortion, at the depth at which it was sent. The revelation was delivered. Your actual frequency is higher than your habitual operating baseline. The revelation has been communicating with you longer than you have been receiving it consciously. The exception is the confirmation that both of these things are now receivable at the level where they reorganize the operating ground, rather than informing the mind. Receive it, not as information to integrate, as the ground to operate from. Move through today as the frequency the exception confirmed, not as someone approaching it, as someone who just received the field's direct confirmation that they are already in it.
Before you leave, ask yourself one question. What if the greatest shift in your life doesn't begin with the world changing, but with the way you see it? The possibilities around you may be far greater than you notice each day. Every decision, every moment of attention, and every action can open one path while closing another. Maybe this wasn't a message that reality was waiting just for you. Maybe it was a reminder that the next chapter of your life is shaped by what you choose to focus on today. If this video made you stop and think, don't ignore that feeling. Stay curious, keep exploring. Because sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of the biggest transformation. And remember, the next moment you call ordinary could be the one that changes everything.